The telephone call that summoned Hercule Poirot to Greenhollow Estate came at precisely 9:15 on a fog-shrouded morning in late October. He had been arranging his breakfast with the methodical precision that characterized all his actions. The marmalade at exactly the correct distance from the toast, the coffee cup positioned just so, when the shrill ring interrupted his domestic symphony. "Poirot here," he said, his accent lending a musical quality to the simple words. "Thank God." The voice on the other end was breathless with panic. "This is Inspector Japp. I need you at Greenhollow Estate in Sussex immediately. We have a locked room murder, and it's impossible." Poirot's green eyes sharpened with interest. "Impossible, mon ami. Nothing is impossible. There are only things which have not yet been properly understood." "Well, you can try understanding this," Japp said grimly. "Lady Vivian Greenhollow, last of the old Greenhollow line, found dead in her private study this morning. Door locked from the inside, key in the lock, window secured from within, no other way in or out. And here's the peculiar part. She was poisoned by her morning tea, but the teapot on the tray contained nothing but ordinary Earl Grey." Poirot set down his coffee cup with a small, precise click. "And the motive? Money, of course. Always money with these old families. Lady Vivian was due to sign a new will yesterday evening, cutting out most of her relatives in favor of some distant American cousin she'd never met. The signing was postponed due to her sudden illness, and now she's dead." "I shall be there within 2 hours," Poirot said decisively. "Touch nothing, Japp, and permit no one to leave the estate." The journey to Sussex was accomplished in Poirot's usual style. First-class railway carriage, with his small valise positioned precisely in the overhead rack and his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the damp weather. As the train carried him through the autumn countryside, Poirot reflected on what Japp had told him: a locked room, an impossible poisoning, and a will that was never signed. The little grey cells were already beginning to stir with interest. Greenhollow Estate revealed itself through the morning mist like something from a Gothic romance. The great house was built of warm, red brick weathered to russet and gold, its Tudor origins enhanced by later Elizabethan additions that created a pleasing asymmetry. Tall chimneys pierced the grey sky, and mullioned windows gazed out across formal gardens that even in autumn retained their austere beauty. Beyond the gardens, Poirot could glimpse the dark waters of an ornamental lake, its surface disturbed by the movement of swans. Inspector Japp met him at the main entrance, his bulldog features creased with worry. "Poirot, thank heaven you're here. This case has me completely baffled. The family are all at each other's throats, the servants are terrified, and the local constabulary are convinced it's suicide, which it plainly isn't." "Lead me to the scene," Poirot said simply. Lady Vivian's private study was a small, comfortable room on the ground floor, lined with books and furnished with pieces that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth. The lady herself had been discovered in a high-backed chair beside the fireplace, a small tea tray on the table at her elbow. She had been, Poirot estimated, a woman of perhaps 70 years, with the fine bone structure that marked good breeding, and the silver hair that spoke of dignity, maintained even in death. "The doctor estimates she died between midnight and 2 o'clock this morning," Japp explained. "Strychnine poisoning, a particularly unpleasant way to go. But here's the mystery. The teacup beside her contained traces of the poison, but the teapot on the tray was completely clean. How does poison get into a cup when the pot it came from is innocent?" Poirot examined the scene with his characteristic thoroughness. He studied the position of the chair, the angle of the teacup, the arrangement of objects on the desk. His eyes, bright and intelligent, missed nothing. "Tell me about the family," he said at length. "There's quite a collection of them." Japp consulted his notebook. "Mr. Marcus Greenhollow, Lady Vivian's nephew, he's the current heir under the old will. Then there's his sister, Miss Evelyn Greenhollow, who's lived here as companion to Lady Vivian for the past 15 years. There's also Mr. Roderick Ashworth, Lady Vivian's godson, and his wife Celia. They've been staying here for the past week. And the American cousin who was to inherit? Miss Margaret Thornfield. Arrived from Boston just 3 days ago, caused quite a stir, apparently. Lady Vivian took to her immediately. Said she was the image of the original Margaret Greenhollow, the last daughter of the old family legend. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Ah, yes. The legend. You will tell me about this, s'il vous plaît. Jap looked slightly embarrassed. Local folklore, mostly. The story goes that in the 17th century, the last daughter of the original Greenhollow line disappeared one night during a terrible storm. Some say she drowned herself in the lake rather than see the estate pass to a distant cousin she despised. Others claim she ran away with a lover. Her portrait hangs in the long gallery, and according to the servants, Miss Thornfield is her living image. Interesting, Poirot murmured. And where is this Miss Thornfield now? In the morning room with the others. Shall I have them brought in for questioning? Presently. First, I wish to understand the geography of this impossible crime. Poirot moved to the door, examining the lock with minute care. You see, Jap, the door was indeed locked from the inside. The key is here, in the lock, on this side of the door. The windows, he moved to inspect them, are secured with catches that can only be operated from within. There is no other entrance to this room, and yet somehow poison found its way into Lady Vivian's teacup, while the teapot remained innocent. Exactly. It's impossible. Non, mon ami, it is merely improbable. And the improbable, when it occurs, usually conceals a very simple truth. Poirot straightened, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. But first, we must meet our suspects, for I assure you, among that small gathering of relatives and guests, there sits a murderer who believed they had committed the perfect crime. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and looked back at the peaceful study where Lady Vivian Greenhollow, the last daughter of an ancient line, had met her end. Tell me, Jap, he said softly, has anyone mentioned whether Lady Vivian was in the habit of taking tea alone in her study at night? No. That's another odd thing. According to the housekeeper, Lady Vivian never took tea after dinner, said it kept her awake. Yet there she was, with a full tea service at what must have been well past midnight. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. Ah, now we begin to see the shape of this puzzle. Someone wanted Lady Vivian in that study, alone in the middle of the night. Someone who knew her habits well enough to lure her there with something she would not normally do. He smiled, a small, satisfied expression. Come, Jap. Let us meet the family, for I believe the last daughter of Greenhollow has one more secret to reveal before her story ends. The morning room at Greenhollow Estate bore witness to 5 decades of accumulated grief and genteel decay. Pale green silk wallpaper, faded to the color of old jade, caught the wan October light filtering through tall windows that overlooked gardens where roses had long since surrendered to autumn's advance. The assembled family occupied the space like actors reluctantly gathered for a final performance, each maintaining their distance from the others with the careful precision of people who had learned to navigate years of accumulated resentment. Marcus Greenhollow stood with his back to the fireplace, a man of 45 whose expensive tweeds could not quite conceal the soft corruption of too much comfort and too little purpose. His face, florid with good living and present distress, bore the expression of someone who had always expected inheritance as his natural right, and now found that expectation threatened. His hands, Poirot noted, trembled slightly as he adjusted his watch chain, a nervous gesture that spoke of deeper anxieties than mere grief. Beside him, perched on the edge of a brocaded settee like a sparrow uncertain of its welcome, sat Miss Evelyn Greenhollow. She was a woman of perhaps 42, dressed in unrelieved black that seemed to drain what little color remained in her thin face. Her hands worked constantly at a lace handkerchief, twisting it into intricate knots that spoke of years spent managing. other people's lives, while her own remained carefully invisible. There was something of the professional companion about her, that particular combination of deference and quiet authority that came from decades of managing a household that was never quite her own. Near the windows, where the morning light revealed both their beauty and their flaws, stood Mr. and Mrs. Roderick Ashworth. Roderick was perhaps 30, with the easy handsomeness of a man who had learned early that charm could substitute for achievement. His fair hair showed the careful attention of a man vain about his appearance, and his clothes bore the subtle shabbiness of someone living beyond their means with studied elegance. His wife, Celia, was a small, dark woman whose sharp features and restless eyes suggested an intelligence that had found few outlets in her present circumstances. She stood close to her husband, but Poirot observed that they did not touch, a detail that spoke volumes about the state of their marriage. Finally, occupying a high-backed chair near the unlit grate, sat the American cousin who had arrived like a catalyst to transform the family's careful equilibrium. Miss Margaret Thornfield was perhaps 28, with the kind of striking features that would have been called handsome rather than pretty in any generation. Her dark hair was dressed simply, and her mourning clothes, while appropriate, lacked the studied elegance of English mourning dress. Most remarkable were her eyes, a peculiar shade of grey-green that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and observation. She sat with perfect composure, but Poirot detected the tension in her stillness, the careful control of someone who knew herself to be under scrutiny. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence with surgical precision. "I regret the circumstances that bring us together, but I assure you that the truth will emerge. It always does, when one knows where to look for it." Inspector Japp cleared his throat awkwardly. "This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. He's been called in to assist with the investigation into Lady Vivian's death." "Investigation?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the word. "Surely the matter is clear enough. My aunt was found dead in her locked study. The door was secured from within, the windows fastened. If it wasn't suicide, which I refuse to believe, then it was some sort of accident." "An accident involving strychnine, monsieur." Poirot's eyebrows rose delicately. "That would be a most unusual accident indeed." Celia Ashworth shivered at the word strychnine, and Poirot filed the reaction away for future consideration. "Now then," he continued, "let us establish the facts with precision. Lady Vivian was found at 7 o'clock this morning by Miss Evelyn. The door to the study was locked from within, the key in the lock on the inside. She had been dead for some hours. The doctor estimates between midnight and 2 o'clock. She was discovered beside a tea service, having apparently consumed tea containing a fatal dose of poison. But Aunt Vivian never took tea at night," Evelyn protested, her voice thin with distress. "She always said it kept her awake. I brought her usual tisane to her bedroom at 10 o'clock, as I always do. She drank it while we talked, then dismissed me. She said she was tired and wanted to sleep." "Ah," Poirot murmured. "But someone persuaded her to break the habit of a lifetime. Someone brought her down to that study and convinced her to drink tea at an hour, when she would normally have been fast asleep. This suggests a person who knew her habits intimately, does it not?" The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Poirot allowed it to stretch, his bright eyes moving from face to face, cataloguing reactions. Marcus's defensive bluster, Evelyn's frightened tears, the Ashworths' careful neutrality, and Margaret Thornfield's composed attention. "Let us establish each person's movements last evening," Poirot continued methodically. "Miss Evelyn, you took the tisane to Lady Vivian at 10 o'clock. What then?" "I stayed with her until 10:30, then went to my room. I read for a while, a novel by Mrs. Gaskell, then extinguished my light at 11:30. "And you heard nothing during the night?" "Nothing unusual. The wind was quite strong. It's an old house. It creaks and settles." Poirot turned to Marcus. "And yourself, monsieur?" "I went to my study after dinner to review some estate papers. I remained there until nearly midnight, then went directly to my room. He hesitated slightly. I may have passed near Aunt Vivian's quarters, but I saw no light under her door. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, Roderick answered for both of them. We retired together at 10:30. Celia had a headache. The strain of the day, you understand. We went directly to our room and remained there. Finally, Poirot's gaze settled on Margaret Thornfield. "And you, mademoiselle?" "I took a walk in the gardens after dinner. I needed air after the tension of the evening. Lady Vivian had been quite distressed about the will signing being postponed. When I returned, around 11, I saw a tea tray in the hall. I assumed it was meant for Lady Vivian, so I carried it to her study door. She called out that I should leave it on the table outside, which I did. Then I went to my room." "You did not see her?" "No, the door was closed, but I could hear her moving about inside." Marcus turned on her with sudden vehemence. "How convenient. You carry the poisoned tea to my aunt's door, and hours later she's dead, just before she could sign the will that would have made you wealthy beyond imagining." Margaret's composure never wavered. "Or perhaps, Mr. Greenhollow, someone else found it convenient that Lady Vivian should die before that will could be signed. After all, with the new will unsigned, the estate reverts to the previous beneficiary. That would be you, would it not?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. But Poirot noticed something else. A quick, frightened glance between Roderick and Celia Ashworth, and the way Evelyn's knuckles had turned white as she gripped her handkerchief. "Money," he murmured softly, "is indeed a powerful motive. But there is something here that troubles me greatly." He moved to the center of the room, his patent leather shoes silent on the Persian carpet. "You all speak of wills and inheritance, but you do not speak of the woman herself. Lady Vivian was methodical, was she not? A creature of precise habits." "Obsessively so," Roderick confirmed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Then I ask you again, who convinced a woman who never varied her routine to suddenly prepare tea at midnight and drink it alone in her study? Someone she trusted absolutely. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate her habits and her affections." Poirot's eyes moved slowly from face to face, and in the growing silence of the morning room, each person seemed to shrink a little under his gaze. The game, as he well knew, was now truly beginning. The library at Greenhollow Estate possessed the particular atmosphere that Hercule Poirot found most conducive to extracting truth from reluctant witnesses. The room stretched the length of the east wing, its walls lined floor to ceiling with volumes accumulated over 3 centuries of Greenhollow prosperity. The scent of old leather and beeswax polish seemed to encourage confession, as though the accumulated wisdom of ages demanded honesty from those who entered. Poirot had arranged the interviews with his characteristic precision, positioning himself behind the massive oak desk where generations of Greenhollow patriarchs had conducted their affairs. Inspector Japp sat to one side with his notebook, while the autumn light filtering through tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian carpet. The interviews begin. Miss Evelyn Greenhollow entered first, her nervous energy filling the vast space like smoke. She perched on the edge of a leather armchair, her hands continuing their relentless assault on the lace handkerchief that had become her constant companion since the discovery of her aunt's body. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began with gentle authority, "you are closer to Lady Vivian than anyone. In 15 years of companionship, you must have observed her habits, her fears, her secrets. Tell me, was she afraid of anything?" Evelyn's pale eyes darted toward the door before returning to meet his gaze. "She was afraid of being alone, Monsieur Poirot. That is why I remained all these years, even when others might have... well, when circumstances might have suggested a different course. She needed me. And yet last night she dismissed you early. At 10:30, you said. Did this not strike you as unusual?" She seemed agitated, restless. When I brought her tisane, she drank it quickly, almost impatiently. She kept glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece. She said she had matters to attend to and wished to be left alone. Evelyn's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But there was something else, Monsieur Poirot. She was clutching a letter when I entered. Blue stationery. Very distinctive. She tried to hide it beneath her blotter, but I caught a glimpse of the corner. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Blue stationery. Have you seen such paper before in the house? The hesitation that followed was eloquent in its duration. I believe I've seen Mrs. Ashworth using similar paper for her correspondence, though of course it is common enough. When Evelyn departed, scurrying from the room like a frightened sparrow, Poirot made a careful note in his mental catalogue. A letter on blue paper, received shortly before Lady Vivian's death. This was no coincidence. Marcus Greenhollow entered with characteristic bluster, attempting to fill the library with his presence and his grievances. But Poirot observed the telltale signs of deeper anxiety, the perspiration on his upper lip despite the room's chill, the way his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his waistcoat. This interrogation is preposterous, Poirot, Marcus began before settling into his chair. We should be arranging the funeral, not submitting to questions like common criminals. It's obvious that American woman is responsible. She admitted carrying the tea tray herself. Ah, but the mystery is not who carried the tray, monsieur, but who poisoned the cup. The teapot, as you know, was entirely innocent. Poirot leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the patience of a naturalist observing a particularly interesting specimen. Tell me about your financial circumstances. They have been challenging recently? The flush that spread across Marcus's features was answer enough, but he pressed on with wounded dignity. My investments have encountered temporary setbacks, nothing that cannot be resolved with time and proper management, but I won't pretend I didn't resent my aunt's decision to alter her will. To leave everything to a complete stranger based on some romantic nonsense about family resemblance, it was madness. You mentioned passing near Lady Vivian's quarters last night. Did you observe anything unusual? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I heard voices around midnight, low voices coming from the direction of her study. One was definitely Aunt Vivian's. The other— He paused, seeming to weigh his words. The other sounded like a man. A man? Poirot's eyebrows rose delicately. Most interesting. And yet the dossier was locked from the inside when she was discovered. I don't pretend to understand it. I only know what I heard. The Ashworths' stories. Roderick and Celia Ashworth were interviewed separately, but their accounts aligned with suspicious precision, too precise, perhaps, for complete truthfulness. Both claimed to have retired early and slept soundly. Both professed ignorance about blue stationery. Yet when Poirot probed deeper into Roderick's relationship with his godmother, cracks appeared in his polished facade. Lady Vivian had become increasingly suspicious in recent months, Roderick admitted, his usual charm faltering as he examined his manicured fingernails. She believed someone was embezzling from the estate accounts. Small amounts initially, then larger sums. She'd taken to checking the books herself, despite having no head for figures. And was she correct in these suspicions? Roderick met Poirot's gaze with defiance that didn't quite reach his eyes. I wouldn't know. I'm not privy to the estate's financial details. Celia's interview revealed little beyond a sharp intelligence constrained by circumstances and a barely concealed resentment toward the family that had provided her with comfort but never acceptance. Her answers were precise, economical, and told Poirot exactly what she intended him to know, which was, he suspected, very little indeed. Margaret's revelation. Finally, Margaret Thornfield entered the library with the composed grace that seemed to characterize all her movements. She settled opposite Poirot with a directness that was refreshingly American in its honesty. "You're wondering why I came here, Monsieur Poirot," she said before he could speak. "Why a stranger would cross an ocean to visit an elderly woman she'd never met." The question had indeed occurred to me, mademoiselle. I received a letter from Lady Vivian 3 months ago. She said she was surrounded by people waiting for her to die. She needed someone of her own blood who hadn't been corrupted by years of expectation and disappointment. She sent money for my passage and begged me to come. And the inheritance she proposed to leave you. I neither asked for it nor wanted it. I have my own life in Boston, my teaching position at the university. But she insisted the estate was dying under current management and needed, as she put it, new blood with old values. Margaret paused, then reached into her reticule. There's something I didn't mention in front of the others, Monsieur Poirot. When I set the tea tray outside Lady Vivian's door last night, I noticed something on the floor near the threshold. A small glass vial, empty. She produced a delicate bottle of blue glass, stoppered and antique in design. I picked it up, intending to ask Lady Vivian about it this morning. Poirot accepted the vial with a handkerchief, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. It was an old medicine bottle, the kind used for laudanum or other tinctures in the previous century. A faint, bitter odor clung to the glass. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, "you have done a dangerous thing by keeping this. But you have also provided me with a crucial piece of the puzzle." Poirot's synthesis. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the library floor, Poirot sat alone, arranging the facts with the same precision he brought to organizing his breakfast table. A letter on blue stationery. A midnight visitor whose voice Marcus had heard. Financial irregularities that had aroused Lady Vivian's suspicions. An antique poison bottle found outside a locked door. And threading through it all, the mystery of how poison had entered a teacup while leaving the teapot entirely innocent. He rose and walked to the tall windows, gazing out at the formal gardens where autumn had painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold. In the distance, the ornamental lake reflected the grey sky like a mirror, its surface disturbed only by the graceful movement of swans. "The method begins to reveal itself," he murmured to himself. "But the psychology, that is where the true solution lies. For this crime was not committed in passion or desperation, but with careful planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. Someone who knew exactly how to lure Lady Vivian from her bed at midnight. Someone who understood her fears, her obsessions, her unshakable routines." He turned back to the library, his gaze falling on the empty chairs where his suspects had sat. The murderer is among them, of that I am certain. But which one possessed both the opportunity and the particular knowledge necessary to execute such a plan? The little grey cells were working now with increasing intensity, sorting through possibilities, discarding impossibilities, seeking the one thread that would unravel the entire tapestry of deception. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot was beginning to see the shape of his opponent's strategy. "Patience," he counseled himself. "The truth will emerge, as it always does. But first, we must visit the Long Gallery, for I have a suspicion that the portrait of the first Margaret, the last daughter of Greenhollow, has more to tell us than mere family resemblance." The afternoon was advancing, and with it the investigation that would either unmask a killer or claim another victim. In the growing shadows of Greenhollow Estate, someone was watching, waiting, and perhaps already planning their next move in this deadly game of inheritance and revenge. The Long Gallery at Greenhollow Estate stretched the entire length of the house's western wing, a corridor of memory where centuries of family history gazed down from gilded frames. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light that filtered through tall windows, illuminating the stern faces of Greenhollow, ancestors who seemed to watch Poirot's progress with varying degrees of approval and suspicion. The air carried the scent of beeswax polish and something less tangible, the accumulated weight of secrets preserved in oil and canvas. Poirot moved along the gallery with measured steps, his patent leather shoes clicking softly on the polished oak floor. Inspector Japp followed, notebook ready, though he remained puzzled by this particular line of investigation. The detective paused occasionally to examine a portrait, his bright eyes cataloguing details with characteristic precision, but his true destination lay at the gallery's heart. The portrait of the last daughter. The painting commanded the central wall between two windows, positioned to catch the best light throughout the day. It depicted a young woman of perhaps 25, dressed in the dark velvet and white lace of the mid-17th century. The artist had captured her with remarkable skill, the high cheekbones, the determined chin, and, most strikingly, those gray-green eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and melancholy. The brass plaque beneath read, "Margaret Greenhollow, 1655-1673, the last daughter, lost to the waters that she loved." "The resemblance to Miss Thornfield is indeed extraordinary," Poirot murmured, adjusting his position to study the background details. "But observe, Jap, the painter has included the ornamental lake in the distance, and in her hand she holds what appears to be a document of some kind. Even in death, she seems to guard her secrets." "Remarkable likeness," came a thin voice from behind them. Miss Evelyn Greenhollow approached hesitantly, her eternal handkerchief twisted between nervous fingers. Lady Vivian was quite obsessed with the portrait, particularly after Miss Thornfield's arrival. She would stand here for hours, comparing features, muttering about signs and destiny. Poirot turned his full attention to the companion. "Obsessed, you say? In what manner precisely?" Evelyn glanced around the empty gallery before speaking in lowered tones. She'd been researching the original Margaret's disappearance for weeks, consulting old family documents, even writing to a historian at Cambridge. She claimed she'd discovered something important about what really happened that night in 1673, something that would change everything. She was quite feverish about it, especially after Miss Thornfield arrived. She said the resemblance was providence, that Margaret had returned to expose old lies and save the estate. And did she share this discovery? No. She said she needed to verify certain facts before making accusations, but she was excited, almost manic. That was 3 days ago. Evelyn's voice dropped further. The same day she received that letter on blue stationery. Roderick's revelation. As Evelyn departed, wringing her handkerchief with renewed vigor, another figure emerged from the gallery's shadows. Roderick Ashworth approached with uncharacteristic hesitancy, his usual charm replaced by obvious anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, glancing around to ensure privacy, "there's something I should have mentioned earlier. About the blue stationery. I've seen such paper before, but not from Celia's correspondence. Letters have been arriving for her, from London, on that exact paper. She burns them immediately after reading, but lately she's been different, anxious, always watching for the post." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed. And last night, after we learned of Lady Vivian's death, I found Celia in our room, burning something in the grate. It wasn't paper. It smelled like fabric. Blue fabric, I think. When I asked her about it, she claimed it was just an old scarf, but..." He shook his head. "We're all desperate here, Poirot. Money does strange things to people." "The discovery." Before Poirot could pursue this revelation further, hurried footsteps echoed from the gallery entrance. Constable Miller appeared, red-faced and breathless. "Inspector Japp sent me, sir. We found something in the garden. The gardener was clearing leaves near the lake and discovered something buried in the rhododendrons. You'd best see for yourself." The afternoon air carried a sharp chill as they made their way to the ornamental lake. A cluster of figures surrounded something on the grass, a small leather case lined with worn velvet. Inside, nestled in molded indentations, lay a set of antique apothecary vials. One space was conspicuously empty. "Freshly buried," Japp explained. "The gardener's dog wouldn't stop digging at the spot." He pointed to the case's lid, where gold lettering had been stamped into the leather. "M.G." Poirot knelt beside the case, examining it without touching. The craftsmanship spoke of considerable age. This was no recent acquisition. "This belongs to the house, Jap. It has resided here for generations. But someone removed it from its proper place, used one vial, doubtless containing strychnine, and then attempted to conceal the evidence." "Attempted rather clumsily," Jap observed. "Precisely. Almost too clumsily, one might say. Why bury it here, beside the lake where legend claims the first Margaret met her end? Someone wishes us to make specific connections, to follow a particular trail of reasoning." Poirot stood, brushing dirt from his knees with meticulous care. As he did so, a movement at an upper window caught his attention. A curtain twitched and fell back into place. Someone had been watching their discovery from Miss Evelyn's room. Poirot's synthesis. "The pattern begins to emerge," Poirot said quietly as they walked back toward the house. "We have assumed this murder was about inheritance, about money and greed. But what if the true motive lies deeper, in secrets that have festered for centuries?" Lady Vivian discovered something about the original Margaret's fate. Something that threatened not just reputations, but perhaps legal claims to the estate itself. "You're suggesting someone killed to protect a 300-year-old secret." "I'm suggesting, mon ami, that in families such as this, the past is never truly buried. It lives in portraits, in documents, in stories passed down through generations, and sometimes, when that past threatens to surface, it kills." Poirot paused at the house's entrance, his green eyes bright with purpose. "We must examine Lady Vivian's private papers immediately. Somewhere in her study or bedroom lie the documents that cost her life, and we must speak with the servants about this apothecary case. I wish to know exactly where it was kept before it found its way into the rhododendrons." The afternoon shadows were lengthening, and with them, Poirot sensed, the investigation was approaching a crucial juncture. The physical evidence was mounting: a missing blue letter, burnt fabric, an ancient poison case, and a portrait that seemed to watch over it all with painted eyes full of secrets. But it was the psychology of the crime that fascinated him most, the careful manipulation of legend and history to create the perfect cover for murder. Someone in Greenhollow Estate believed they had committed the perfect crime, using the past to conceal the present. But Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were beginning to perceive the truth beneath the elaborate deception. The last daughter of Greenhollow had indeed returned, not as a ghost, but as the key to unraveling a web of lies that had been 3 centuries in the making. "Come, Jap," he said briskly. "The shadows grow long, and in such shadows, dangerous truths may finally emerge into the light." Lady Vivian's private chambers occupied the east wing's most secluded corner, a suite of rooms that reflected the methodical precision of their late occupant. Poirot entered with the reverence due to the dead, his green eyes cataloguing every detail with characteristic thoroughness. The bedroom remained untouched since the previous evening, the 4-poster bed made with military precision, the dressing table arranged with mathematical order, and on the nightstand, the empty tisane cup that Miss Evelyn had brought at 10 o'clock. The search for truth. Inspector Japp followed as Poirot moved to Lady Vivian's private study, a smaller, more intimate space adjoining the bedroom. Here, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and family photographs, the lady had conducted her most personal affairs. A steel deed box rested in the corner, its lock gleaming with recent use. "The key, mademoiselle?" Poirot inquired of Evelyn, who had accompanied them with obvious reluctance. With trembling fingers, she produced it from a hidden pocket in her dress. "Lady Vivian made me promise that if anything happened to her, this should only be opened in the presence of proper authority and the family." Within the hour, the small study was crowded with suspects, each wearing expressions ranging from hope to dread. The deed box revealed its secrets methodically. Property deeds, insurance policies, stock certificates, and near the top, a thick envelope bearing the letterhead of Blackwood & Sons, Genealogical Research, London. Poirot slit the envelope with careful precision, his eyebrows rising as he scanned the contents. "Most illuminating," he murmured. "Dr. Edmund Hartley of Cambridge has made remarkable discoveries regarding the original Margaret Greenhollow's fate. It appears, mesdames et messieurs, that the legend of the last daughter drowning herself in 1673 was a fabrication." He read selected passages aloud. "Documentary evidence suggests Margaret Greenhollow did not perish, but fled to the American colonies under an assumed name. Marriage records and birth certificates indicate a legitimate line of descent that predates the current family succession. If authenticated, these findings would establish prior claims to the Greenhollow Estate." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's face drained of color, while the Ashworths exchanged meaningful glances. Margaret Thornfield sat perfectly still, absorbing the implications. The blackmail revealed. Continuing his search, Poirot discovered a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, hidden beneath household accounts. The blue stationery was unmistakable, the handwriting modern and educated. Though unsigned, their content was clear, veiled threats regarding financial irregularities and certain arrangements that would prove embarrassing if revealed. The final letter, Poirot announced, is dated 2 days before Lady Vivian's death. It reads, "Your investigation into family history has become dangerous. Some secrets are better left buried with the dead. Meet me in your study at midnight on the 27th, and we shall discuss terms for my continued silence. Come alone, and tell no one." "She kept it," Evelyn whispered, "despite the instruction to destroy it." Indeed, Lady Vivian was gathering evidence against her blackmailer, but she underestimated their desperation. Poirot examined the paper closely. Expensive stationery, purchased from a London supplier, and there is a faint scent. Lavender water of a particular quality not commonly available in the countryside. Physical evidence and deduction. Returning to the ground floor study where the murder had occurred, Poirot examined the scene with renewed purpose. In daylight, details previously obscured became apparent. Near the chair where Lady Vivian had died, he discovered a small stain on the carpet, tea that had been spilled but not from the fatal cup. Someone was careless here, Jap. In arranging the scene, they splashed tea where none should have been. He knelt, examining the locked door from within. "This key troubles me greatly. See these fresh scratches? The lock shows signs of manipulation, as though it was turned from outside after the door was closed. But that's impossible. The key was on the inside. Impossible if one accepts the obvious explanation. But suppose the key was placed in the lock after Lady Vivian was already dead. The room was not locked during the murder, only made to appear so afterward." The second victim. Their investigation was interrupted by hurried footsteps in the corridor. A telegram boy appeared, red-faced and breathless, bearing news that struck the assembled company like a thunderbolt. Margaret Thornfield accepted the telegram with steady hands, though her face paled as she read. "Dr. Hartley is dead," she announced quietly. "Killed yesterday morning in a railway accident while traveling to Greenhollow. The authorities report his compartment door came open while the train was at speed. He fell to his death." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Poirot took the telegram, his expression grave. No accident, this. Dr. Hartley possessed knowledge that someone could not permit him to share. He has been silenced, just as Lady Vivian was silenced. The web tightens. "We are dealing with a murderer of considerable cunning," Poirot continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Someone who kills not in passion, but with careful calculation. They have created an elaborate puzzle. The locked room, the buried poison case, the theatrical elements designed to evoke old legends. But in their cleverness, they have revealed more than they intended." He studied each face in turn. Marcus's defensive bluster, Evelyn's frightened tears, the Ashworths' carefully neutral expressions, Margaret's composed attention. "The murderer sits among us now," Poirot said softly. "Someone who knew Lady Vivian's habits intimately, Someone who could lure her from her bed at midnight with a promise or threat she could not ignore. Someone who understood exactly how to manipulate both her fears and her sense of justice. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the study where Lady Vivian had met her end. In those shadows, Poirot sensed, lay the key to unraveling this web of deception that stretched back 3 centuries. "Tomorrow," he announced, Dr. Hartley was to have presented his evidence, but his research notes, his documentation, these must exist somewhere. Lady Vivian wrote in her journal that she had hidden crucial documents where only Margaret would think to look. Until those papers are found, we are all in danger. For the murderer knows that their secret is not yet safe, and they have already shown they will kill to protect it. The last daughter's revenge, it seemed, had only just begun. But Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were, working with increasing intensity, sorting through the layers of deception to find the truth that someone had killed twice to conceal. Outside, the first drops of evening rain began to fall, pattering against the windows like whispers from the past, promising that before another night had passed, the mystery of Greenhollow Estate would finally yield its secrets to the methodical genius of the world's greatest detective. Evening descended upon Greenhollow Estate with the weight of accumulated secrets, the autumn rain drumming against ancient windows like fingers tapping an impatient rhythm. Poirot had requested the servants' attendance in the library, knowing that those who cleaned and maintained the great house often observed what the family preferred to keep hidden. The flickering lamplight cast shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of 3 centuries. The servants reveal their secrets. Mrs. Hodges, the housekeeper whose 30 years of service had made her privy to countless family dramas, entered first. Her composure cracked under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning about the apothecary case. "It was kept in the still room, sir, locked away since my grandmother's time. Lady Vivian kept the key in her private study. Said those old medicines were dangerous, but any of the family could have taken it when she was elsewhere." "And the night of the murder?" The hesitation that followed was eloquent. "I heard voices around midnight, sir. Lady Vivian was angry. She said something like, 'You have betrayed everything our family stood for.'" Then another voice, quieter. "Afterward, I saw someone leaving quickly toward the east wing, but the hall was dim." Young Annie, the parlour maid, provided even more damaging testimony. "I saw Miss Margaret that night, sir, around 11:30. She came down carrying something wrapped in cloth, went straight to where the tea service was kept. When Margaret was summoned, she listened with remarkable composure before explaining, 'I prepared the tray myself. Lady Vivian had mentioned she might work late. I wrapped the pot to keep it warm. Yet earlier, you stated you found the tray already prepared,' Poirot observed mildly. 'I misspoke in the morning's confusion.' The strychnine connection. A telegram interrupted the proceedings, delivered by a rain-soaked constable. Poirot read aloud. "Strychnine purchase recorded 6 weeks ago. Buyer gave name as E. Greenhollow. Village pharmacist confirms transaction." Evelyn's face drained of colour. "I purchased it at Lady Vivian's request for poisoning rats in the old stables. She gave me a note for the pharmacist. Anyone could have taken it from the still room afterward." Poirot's demonstration. At precisely midnight, with all suspects assembled under Japp's watchful eye, Poirot positioned himself in Lady Vivian's study to recreate the crime. Through the closed door, he manipulated the tea service, creating sounds that carried clearly to the corridor. Then came silence. When the door opened, Poirot stood beside the untouched tea service. The murderer's deception becomes clear. Lady Vivian was not poisoned by tea drunk in this room. She was already dying when she entered. The tea service was arranged afterward to create a false narrative. He demonstrated how the door could be locked from outside using a thin implement through the keyhole, leaving the key in place within. The scratches I noted earlier confirmed this manipulation. The room was locked after death to suggest suicide or accident. The psychological portrait. This murderer thinks in terms of theatre, Poirot continued, studying each face with penetrating intensity. Someone educated, with access to historical knowledge and the ability to manipulate perceptions. The blue letters, the buried poison case, the theatrical locked room, all designed to scatter our attention across multiple suspects. He moved before Marcus first. Greed is powerful, monsieur, but is it enough to drive a man to murder his aunt for an inheritance already slipping away? Then to Roderick. Fear of exposure creates desperate actions. When blackmail victims turn the tables, blackmailers become hunted. Finally, to the assembled group. The murderer believes they are safe, that evidence died with Dr. Hartley. But they have forgotten something crucial. Lady Vivian wrote that she hid documents where only Margaret would think to look. The trap is baited. Tomorrow morning, Poirot announced, we shall examine the portrait in the long gallery together. I suspect the hiding place lies within the image itself, perhaps behind the canvas or concealed in the frame. He watched reactions carefully. Roderick's sudden stillness, Marcus leaning forward with interest, the flicker of calculation in Celia's eyes. Tonight, I shall keep watch in the long gallery myself. No one is to enter that wing. The documents will remain safe until morning. The vigil begins. As the clock chimed midnight, Poirot positioned himself not in the gallery, but in an alcove near the library. The trap was baited. By announcing his intention to guard the gallery, he had forced the murderer's hand. They would be compelled to retrieve the documents before morning, but would seek another route. At 1 o'clock, a shadow detached from the darkness, moving toward the library's archives section. Poirot smiled in the darkness. His psychological gambit had worked. By focusing attention on the portrait, he had driven the killer to check where the documents might actually be hidden, among the genealogical records where Lady Vivian had spent her final weeks researching. The figure slipped into the library, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Poirot followed silently, watching as desperate hands searched the shelves marked Genealogy and Local History. A heavy volume was pulled free, revealing a hidden compartment. So, Poirot said softly, stepping into the room and flooding it with electric light, you knew exactly where to look, because you watched her hide them. The figure spun around, and in the sudden glare, the face of Lady Vivian's killer was finally revealed, staring back at Poirot with a mixture of terror and defiance. The mask had fallen at last. Celia Ashworth stood frozen in the library's electric glare, her small hands clutching a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the deferential wife who had faded into drawing-room shadows for days. In her place stood a woman whose sharp intelligence had finally been unmasked, her dark eyes calculating distances to doors and windows with the desperate precision of a cornered predator. You will place those documents on the table, madame, Poirot said with quiet authority, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Inspector Japp waits in the corridor, and there are constables at every exit. Your game is finished. For a heartbeat, she seemed to consider flight. Then, with a bitter laugh that held no humor, she moved to the oak table and set down the portfolio with exaggerated care. How long have you known it was me? Suspected from the second day, known with certainty since this evening. Poirot moved closer, his green eyes never leaving her face. The lavender water was your first mistake, a distinctive scent I detected on the blackmail letters. Your handwriting, though disguised, retained certain characteristics I observed in the household accounts you maintained so meticulously for Lady Vivian. The mask falls. Celia's composure cracked visibly, years of careful deception crumbling in moments. She was going to destroy everything, she said, her voice losing its usual soft modulation. Do you understand what that means? 3 years of playing the grateful godson's devoted wife, enduring her lectures about family duty while watching Marcus squander the estate and Roderick accumulate debts that would have ruined us all. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands," Poirot observed. "The embezzlement from the estate accounts. That was your husband's weakness, but the blackmail letters were your solution. Roderick is weak, but he's not evil. His gambling, his poor investments, they were mistakes, not malice. I thought if I could frighten Lady Vivian into making certain arrangements, we could disappear quietly. Start fresh somewhere she'd never find us." Celia moved to the window, staring out at the rain-lashed gardens. Instead, my threats made her more determined. She hired that Cambridge historian, began investigating everything, the accounts, our backgrounds, even the family genealogy. The confession unfolds. And when Miss Thornfield arrived, Poirot prompted gently. That sealed our fate. Lady Vivian became obsessed with proving Margaret was the legitimate heir. If those documents proved her claim, the entire estate would pass out of the family. Our embezzlement would be discovered during the legal proceedings. Prison was inevitable. Celia turned back to face Poirot, her expression hardening with remembered desperation. I sent the final letter, arranging to meet her in the study at midnight. I told her I had discovered Margaret's true purpose, that she was working with American lawyers to seize the estate immediately. Poirot's eyes gleamed with professional interest, despite the horror of what he was hearing. And the method, the locked room, the poisoned teacup while the teapot remained innocent. Celia spoke now with the careful precision of someone who had planned every detail. I prepared Evelyn's tisane that night, adding laudanum from the old medicine chest to ensure Lady Vivian would sleep deeply. Then I took the strychnine Evelyn had purchased for the rats and prepared a single cup of tea, heavily dosed. She paused, seeming to gather strength for the most damning admission. At midnight, I knocked on her bedroom door, claiming urgent news about Margaret. She was groggy from the laudanum, but followed me downstairs. In the study, I had the poisoned tea waiting. I told her to drink while I explained everything, spoke rapidly about fictitious legal documents and conspiracies. The poison works quickly, within minutes. She trusted you completely. Poirot said quietly. She trusted everyone, the foolish woman. Afterward, I arranged the tea service to suggest she'd prepared it herself, used a thin wire through the keyhole to lock the door from outside, leaving the key in place within, then returned to my room where Roderick provided my alibi, never knowing what I'd done. The second murder. And Dr. Hartley. The steel in Poirot's voice was unmistakable now. A necessary precaution. He'd written about bringing definitive proof of Margaret's lineage. I took an early train to London, followed him onto the Brighton Express. Railway accidents happen, Monsieur Poirot. A crowded platform, a stumble near an open door. She shrugged with chilling casualness. Poirot's trap. Revealed. But you made one crucial error, madame. Poirot moved to the table, carefully opening the portfolio she'd been attempting to steal. You assumed Lady Vivian hid her most damaging evidence in obvious places, but she was more clever than you credited. These documents contain not only her detailed journal entries documenting her suspicions about your activities, but also her correspondence with Dr. Hartley, including his preliminary findings that would have exposed your husband's embezzlement even without the American inheritance question. Celia's face drained of color as Poirot read aloud. C.A. has become increasingly desperate in her communications. I fear what such desperation might drive her to attempt. I have therefore taken precautions to ensure the truth survives, even if I do not. She knew, Celia whispered. She suspected what I might do. Indeed, Lady Vivian was far more astute than any of you realized. She left this evidence precisely where she knew her killer would eventually come searching, among the genealogical records where she'd spent her final weeks. She understood that greed and fear would eventually drive you here. The final confrontation. The library door opened to admit Inspector Japp with 2 constables. Celia Ashworth stood perfectly still as the handcuffs closed around her wrists, her expression now empty of everything except the bitter realization that her carefully constructed plan had been anticipated and countered by the very woman she'd murdered. "I regret only that Roderick will suffer for my actions," she said quietly, as Japp prepared to lead her away. "He truly knew nothing of what I'd done." "That, madame," Poirot replied with characteristic precision, "will be for the courts to determine. But I believe your husband's weakness, while costly, was not criminal in intent, unlike your own calculated malice." As the door closed behind the small procession, Poirot remained alone in the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries and the fresh evidence of humanity's capacity for both love and murder. The case was essentially solved, but the final act, the gathering of all parties for his complete exposition, still awaited. In the morning, he would reveal not only the method and motive, but the psychological insights that had led him to unmask a killer who had believed herself safe behind a facade of devoted domesticity. The last daughter of Greenhollow could finally rest in peace. Justice, as Hercule Poirot had promised, would prevail. Dawn broke over Greenhollow Estate with pale, reluctant light, as though the sun itself hesitated to illuminate the scene of so much tragedy. The morning mist clung to the ornamental lake and drifted across formal gardens where autumn had painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Despite the night's dramatic resolution, the great house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act of this 3-century drama to unfold. The final gathering. At precisely 10 o'clock, Poirot had assembled the entire household in the long gallery beneath the watchful gaze of painted ancestors. The morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated each face with unforgiving clarity, revealing the toll that recent events had taken on all present. Marcus Greenhollow stood near the fireplace, his earlier bluster replaced by genuine shock at his godson's wife's arrest. Miss Evelyn twisted her eternal handkerchief with trembling fingers, while Roderick Ashworth sat slumped in a chair, his handsome features aged overnight by the revelation of Celia's crimes. Margaret Thornfield occupied her usual position of composed observation, though Poirot detected a softening in her expression, the wariness of someone who had been vindicated but took no pleasure in the circumstances. Inspector Japp stood ready near the door, his notebook closed now that the confession had been obtained, but his presence lending official weight to the proceedings. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his accent lending musical authority to the words, "Mrs. Ashworth has confessed to the murders of Lady Vivian and Dr. Hartley, but I wish to explain how the little grey cells arrived at this conclusion, for the method reveals much about the psychology of the criminal mind. And there are truths that must be spoken if justice, even imperfect justice, is to be done." The complete psychological analysis. He moved to stand beneath the portrait of the original Margaret Greenhollow, his small figure somehow commanding the entire space. From the beginning, we were presented with an impossible crime, a locked room, a poisoned teacup while the teapot remained innocent, and a victim who had broken her lifelong habits to drink tea at midnight. These impossibilities were deliberately constructed to confuse and misdirect. But consider the psychology required for such elaborate deception. Mrs. Ashworth was not merely desperate. Desperation alone rarely produces such meticulous planning. She was a woman of considerable intelligence, trapped in circumstances that offered no honorable escape. For 3 years, she had played the role of grateful dependent, watching her husband accumulate debts while Lady Vivian controlled their fate with absolute authority. Marcus interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "But Celia seemed so devoted to my aunt. She spent hours helping with correspondence, managing household accounts." "Précisément," Poirot said sharply. "She had access to everything, the accounts where your husband's embezzlement could be detected, the household routines that would allow her to move freely at night, the medicine chest containing both laudanum and strychnine, and most crucially, she possessed intimate knowledge of Lady Vivian's habits, fears, and obsessions." The method revealed in detail. Poirot began to pace with characteristic precision, his hands gesturing expressively. The murder itself demonstrates remarkable cunning. Mrs. Ashworth understood that a straightforward poisoning would immediately focus suspicion on those with access to Lady Vivian's food and drink. Therefore, she created a theatrical puzzle, the locked room that suggested either suicide or supernatural intervention, invoking the legend of the last daughter to add atmospheric confusion. He paused before Evelyn. First, she drugged the evening tisane that you so faithfully delivered, mademoiselle. A simple matter when she had access to the kitchen and your complete trust. The laudanum ensured Lady Vivian would be disoriented and suggestible when summoned at midnight. Then she prepared not a pot of poisoned tea, but a single cup. This is why the teapot was innocent. She needed Lady Vivian to drink that specific cup while distracted by urgent conversation about Miss Thornfield's supposed conspiracy to seize the estate immediately. Roderick raised his head, his voice barely audible. She lured Aunt Vivian with lies about Margaret? Indeed. She told Lady Vivian that she had discovered Margaret was working with American lawyers to claim the estate through immediate legal action, bypassing the will entirely. For a woman already obsessed with family history and genealogy, this was irresistible bait. The evidence compiled. Poirot produced the blue stationery, holding it to the light. The lavender water scent betrayed her identity as the blackmail letter writer. Mrs. Ashworth used her own stationery, believing the disguised handwriting would be sufficient protection. But scent is distinctive, and I detected it both on the letters and in her personal effects. The buried poison case was another theatrical touch, meant to evoke the legend and scatter suspicion across the entire family. But its placement near the lake was too deliberate, too symbolic. It suggested someone thinking in terms of narrative rather than practical concealment. After the poison took effect, and strychnine works with terrible swiftness, Mrs. Ashworth arranged the tea service to suggest Lady Vivian had prepared it herself. The spilled tea I discovered on the carpet was her error, evidence of hasty staging. Then came the locked door, achieved through the simple but effective trick of using thin wire through the keyhole to turn the key from outside, leaving it positioned as though locked from within. The human cost. Poirot's expression softened as he turned to Roderick. Your wife acted alone, monsieur, driven by a toxic combination of love for you and hatred for the circumstances that trapped you both. She convinced herself that murder was the only solution, that removing Lady Vivian would somehow resolve everything. But murder never resolves anything. It only creates new tragedies. I swear to you, Poirot, Roderick said, his voice breaking, I knew nothing of what Celia planned. My gambling debts, the money I took from the estate accounts, these were my sins, but I never imagined she would. I believe you, Poirot replied gently. But your weakness created the soil in which murder took root. You allowed your wife to shoulder burdens that crushed her moral compass, while you remained willfully blind to her growing desperation. Margaret's noble decision. Finally, Poirot turned to Margaret Thornfield. As for you, mademoiselle, Lady Vivian's research confirmed your legitimate descent from the original Margaret. Greenhollow. These documents prove beyond question that you are the rightful heir to Greenhollow Estate. Margaret stood slowly, her composure finally revealing genuine emotion. I never wanted this inheritance, Monsieur Poirot. I came because a lonely old woman asked me to, not for money or revenge. If I could trade all of it to have her alive again. She paused, looking around the gallery at the anxious faces surrounding her. But perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. She moved to stand before Marcus, her voice steady with decision. I will sign whatever papers are necessary to transfer the estate to you, Mr. Greenhollow, as Lady Vivian originally intended, with conditions. Miss Evelyn must be provided for independently, with a generous settlement that ensures her security, and the estate must be placed in a proper trust to prevent further financial mismanagement. You would give up a fortune? Marcus asked, incredulous. "I would give up a burden," Margaret replied simply. "My life is in Boston, with my teaching position and the future I've built there, but I take with me the knowledge that the last daughter's story finally has an ending. She survived, built a new life across the ocean, and her bloodline endures. That is legacy enough." The final truth. Poirot smiled, a genuine expression of approval. "Magnifique, mademoiselle." Lady Vivian would have been pleased. She sought new blood with old values, and she found them indeed. He looked up at the portrait above them, where the painted eyes of the first Margaret seemed to gaze down with something approaching peace. The legend spoke of a daughter lost to the waters she loved. But legends, like lies, have a way of obscuring truth. The original Margaret was not mad or suicidal. She was pregnant and desperate, fleeing a household where her inheritance was to be stolen through legal trickery. Her descendants crossed an ocean, built lives, perhaps forgot the name Greenhollow altogether. Yet here, the official story remained, that she was unstable, unfit to manage the estate. The morning sun illuminated the gallery with growing warmth, and for a moment the weight of centuries seemed to lift from the ancient house. The last daughter had been vindicated, her legitimate line restored, and the woman who had died seeking truth had achieved her final victory, even from beyond the grave. "Come, Jap," Poirot said, straightening his tie with meticulous care. "Our work here approaches its conclusion. Justice has been served, truth has been spoken, and the living must now decide how to honor the dead." As they prepared to leave the long gallery, Poirot took one final look at the portrait that had presided over this drama. The painted eyes held depths of intelligence and melancholy, but perhaps now, finally, a hint of satisfaction as well. The affair at Greenhollow Estate was drawing to its close, and Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had once again proven that no secret, however well buried, could remain hidden from the methodical pursuit of truth. The morning after Celia Ashworth's arrest dawned grey and subdued over Greenhollow Estate, as though the very house itself was recovering from the shock of truth finally revealed. Poirot had spent a restless night in the blue guest room, his methodical mind continuing to sort through the psychological complexities of the case even after the confession had been signed and witnessed. There remained, he knew, loose threads that required careful attention before justice could be considered complete. The methodical conclusion. Inspector Japp found him in Lady Vivian's private study at precisely 8 o'clock, examining the final pieces of correspondence with characteristic thoroughness. The morning light revealed details that had been obscured during the dramatic events of the previous evening, and Poirot's green eyes missed nothing as he catalogued each element with scientific precision. "The confession is signed and sealed, Poirot," Japp announced, settling heavily into the chair opposite the desk. "Mrs. Ashworth will be transferred to London this afternoon to await trial. The case is as good as closed." "Ah, but mon ami," Poirot replied, not looking up from the letter he was examining. "The confession tells us what happened, but not necessarily why it happened in precisely this manner. Consider, Mrs. Ashworth possessed neither the specialized knowledge nor the particular skills required for some aspects of this crime. The manipulation of the lock, for instance, suggests familiarity with such techniques that a desperate housewife would not typically possess." He held up a piece of blue stationery, studying it against the morning light. "And this paper, expensive, distinctive, purchased from a London supplier. Yet Mrs. Ashworth has not been to London in 6 months, according to the household records. Someone provided her with materials, perhaps even guidance. We have caught our murderer, yes, but I suspect she did not act entirely without assistance." Evelyn's burden. As if summoned by Poirot's observations, Miss Evelyn Greenhollow appeared in the doorway, her eternal handkerchief twisted beyond recognition in her trembling hands. The events of the night had aged her visibly, and she moved with the careful steps of someone carrying an unbearable weight. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, Might I speak with you? There is something I must confess before you leave Greenhollow." When Japp had withdrawn to give them privacy, Evelyn settled into the chair where Lady Vivian had conducted so many interviews, her thin frame seeming to disappear into the worn leather. "I've been a coward, Monsieur Poirot. Not a murderer. I swear on everything sacred I knew nothing of Celia's terrible plans, but a coward nonetheless." "Tell me, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, his voice carrying the patience that had drawn countless confessions from guilty consciences. "3 weeks ago, Celia came to me in great distress. She spoke of debts, of Lady Vivian's investigation into the household accounts, of ruin approaching like a storm. She asked me about the old medicines in the still room, whether they were truly dangerous, how they were secured. I thought, God help me, I thought she merely wanted to frighten Lady Vivian somehow, to leverage her fears into some financial arrangement." Evelyn's voice dropped to barely audible levels. "I told her about the strychnine, about how Lady Vivian kept the key to the medicine chest. I even mentioned the blue stationery I had seen her using for important correspondence. Expensive paper she ordered specially from London. When Celia asked where she might obtain similar paper, I gave her the supplier's address." Poirot leaned forward, his expression grave but not unkind. "And when Lady Vivian died?" "I suspected immediately. But I was paralyzed by my own complicity. If I had refused to answer her questions, if I had warned Lady Vivian—" Tears finally escaped, running unchecked down her weathered cheeks. "She was more than my employer, Monsieur Poirot. She was the only family I had ever truly known, and through my weakness, I helped facilitate her murder." The psychological assessment. Poirot rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the formal gardens where autumn had painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold. "You provided information innocently, mademoiselle, without knowledge of how it would be used. The law recognizes this distinction, even if your conscience does not. Mrs. Ashworth made her own choices, planned her own crimes. You are guilty only of misplaced trust." He turned back to face her, his expression kind but firm. "However, you will testify truthfully at the trial about your conversations with Mrs. Ashworth. This is the justice you owe Lady Vivian. Beyond that, you must learn to forgive yourself, for she would not wish you to carry this burden forever." Margaret's resolution. Later that morning, as Poirot reviewed Dr. Hartley's genealogical research with Margaret Thornfield, the full scope of the historical discoveries became clear. The documentation was extensive, meticulous, and legally unassailable. Margaret was indeed the legitimate heir to Greenhollow Estate, descended from a woman history had wrongly branded as mad and suicidal. Lady Vivian spent her final weeks assembling this proof, Margaret explained, her fingers tracing the family tree that connected past to present across 3 centuries. She wrote that she wanted to correct an ancient injustice, to acknowledge that the original Margaret was not unstable, but a woman forced into impossible circumstances by relatives who coveted her. Inheritance. "And now you face the same choice that confronted your ancestor," Poirot observed. "To claim what is rightfully yours, or to seek a different path." Margaret smiled, and for the first time since her arrival at Greenhollow, the expression reached her eyes. "I've already decided, Monsieur Poirot. I will sign whatever documents are necessary to transfer the estate to Marcus, with conditions that ensure proper management and provision for Evelyn's future. My life is in Boston. I have education, independence, a career I love. The original Margaret had none of these advantages. By honoring her memory without claiming her legacy, I give her story the ending she deserved. Vindication without vengeance." The inheritance. Arranged, Marcus Greenhollow, when informed of Margaret's decision, was visibly overwhelmed. The bluster and defensiveness that had characterized his earlier behavior had been replaced by something approaching genuine humility. "I don't deserve such generosity," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I resented you from the moment you arrived. saw you only as a threat to what I considered mine by right. You have shown more honor than any of us." "Then prove worthy of it," Margaret replied simply. "The estate has endured for 3 centuries through wars, plagues, and financial crises. Don't let it die now through mismanagement or greed. Lady Vivian believed in the value of old traditions guided by new wisdom. Honor that belief." Poirot's satisfaction. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the library floor, Poirot sat alone, arranging his final notes with characteristic precision. The case was indeed closed, but not merely through the arrest of a murderer. Justice had been served on multiple levels: legal, moral, and historical. The last daughter's reputation had been restored. Her descendant had chosen honor over wealth, and the living had been given opportunities for redemption. Yet questions remained that would follow him back to London. How did desperation transform a devoted wife into a calculating killer? What forces in human nature allowed love to curdle into murder? These were the mysteries that fascinated him most, not the mechanical details of how crimes were committed, but the psychological factors that drove ordinary people to extraordinary evil. A knock at the library door interrupted his reflections. Inspector Japp entered, his expression indicating that their departure was imminent. "The car is ready, Poirot. Mrs. Ashworth has been transferred to London custody, and all the statements have been taken. We can leave whenever you're prepared." Poirot rose, straightening his tie with meticulous care. "I am ready, mon ami. The affair at Greenhollow is concluded, though I suspect its implications will linger long after we have departed. Come, let us take our leave of this ancient house and its secrets." As they walked toward the side entrance hall, Poirot took one final look at the long gallery, where the portrait of the original Margaret Greenhollow gazed down with painted eyes that seemed finally at peace. Her story, so long obscured by lies and legend, had been restored to truth. And in that restoration, perhaps, lay the greatest justice of all. The last daughter had found her voice at last, speaking across 3 centuries to ensure that truth would triumph over deception and that honor would prevail over greed. It was, Poirot reflected, a fitting conclusion to one of his most psychologically complex cases. The morning of departure from Greenhollow Estate dawned clear and crisp, autumn sunlight streaming through the dissipating mist to illuminate the ancient stones with golden warmth. The household had assembled on the wide front steps to bid farewell to Hercule Poirot and Inspector Japp, a gathering that bore little resemblance to the suspicious, fractured group that had first met the detective days earlier. The final farewells. Marcus Greenhollow stood at the center of the group, his earlier bluster replaced by genuine humility. The revelation of his wife's crimes had stripped away his defensive arrogance, leaving behind a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of responsibility that came with inheritance. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, extending his hand with newfound sincerity, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude. You have not merely solved a crime, you have given us all a chance at redemption." Poirot accepted the handshake with characteristic precision. "The opportunity for redemption, monsieur, has always existed. I've merely removed the obstacles that prevented you from seeing it clearly. Use this second chance wisely. Lady Vivian's faith in the estate's future now rests in your hands." Miss Evelyn Greenhollow approached next, her eternal handkerchief finally still in her hands. The weight of guilt she had carried since her innocent revelations to Celia Ashworth was beginning to lift, replaced by tentative hope for a future that would not be defined by service to others' needs. "You told me to forgive myself," she said quietly. "I am learning to try, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Thornfield's generosity has given me independence I never dared imagine possible." "Independence earned through 15 years of faithful service," Poirot replied gently. "Lady Vivian would be pleased to know that her companion has finally been freed to live for herself." Margaret Thornfield stood slightly apart from the others, her travelling clothes and small valise marking her as someone already mentally departed from Greenhollow's orbit. Yet her expression held no regret, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who had made difficult choices with clear conscience. "You have given me something invaluable, Monsieur Poirot," she said, offering her hand with American directness. "Not just the vindication of my ancestors' reputation, but the knowledge that truth, however long buried, will eventually find its way to light. Truth has a persistence that rivals even the most determined detective." Poirot replied with a slight smile. "The original Margaret waited 3 centuries for justice. Her patience has finally been rewarded." The journey to London. As their car wound through the Sussex countryside, leaving Greenhollow's towers and chimneys to fade into the distance, Inspector Japp broke the contemplative silence that had settled between them. "I still marvel at how you identified Mrs. Ashworth so early," he admitted. "The rest of us were looking at obvious suspects. The heir, the mysterious American, even the devoted companion. But the quiet wife in the background? That took remarkable insight." Poirot adjusted his position to maintain perfect symmetry, his green eyes thoughtful as he gazed out at the passing landscape. "The psychology revealed itself gradually, mon ami. Mrs. Ashworth had cultivated invisibility so thoroughly that she moved through the household like a ghost, observing everything, influencing nothing, or so it appeared. But consider what such a position provided. Access to private correspondence, intimate knowledge of everyone's secrets, the ability to manipulate situations without detection." He ticked off points on his immaculate fingers. "The lavender water first drew my attention, such a distinctive, expensive scent on the blackmail letters. Yet no one else in the household used it. Then there was her reaction when strychnine was mentioned, the careful way she avoided looking at certain people during questioning, and most tellingly, her husband's obvious ignorance of her activities. A man living with a conspirator usually shows some awareness, however subconscious. Roderick Ashworth displayed none. The psychological portrait? What fascinates me most," Poirot continued, "is the transformation required to turn a devoted wife into a calculating murderer. Mrs. Ashworth did not simply decide one day to kill. She evolved into it through a series of moral compromises, each seemingly justified by circumstances." Japp nodded grimly. "First, the embezzlement to cover her husband's debts, then blackmail to secure their future, finally murder when all other options seemed closed." "Précisément." Each step made the next more conceivable, more necessary in her mind. She convinced herself that murder was simply another administrative task, a way to balance the books of her life as efficiently as she had balanced Lady Vivian's household accounts. That is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this case, how evil can disguise itself as practicality. The detective's expression grew more somber as he considered the implications. Mrs. Ashworth possessed intelligence, education, and capability that could have achieved remarkable things if directed toward constructive purposes. Instead, desperation channeled those talents toward destruction. It is a tragedy within a tragedy. The question of justice. As the car approached London's outskirts, suburban streets replacing country lanes, Japp raised the question that had been troubling him since the arrest. "Do you think justice has truly been served, Poirot? Mrs. Ashworth will hang, certainly, but what of the circumstances that created her? The debts, the social pressures, the limited options available to women in her position?" Poirot was quiet for a long moment, considering the complexity of the question. "Justice, mon ami, operates on multiple levels. Legal justice demands punishment for murder. This will be satisfied. But there is also moral justice, which seeks to address the conditions that breed crime. In this case, I believe we have achieved something approaching both," he elaborated with characteristic precision. "Lady Vivian's reputation has been restored, her true wishes honored through Margaret's noble decision. Miss Evelyn has been freed from a life of dependence and guilt. Marcus has been given the opportunity to prove himself worthy of his inheritance, Even Roderick, though he will suffer for his wife's crimes, has been liberated from the cycle of debt and deception that trapped them both. And the murderer herself? Mrs. Ashworth chose her path despite having other options. She could have confessed her husband's embezzlement to Lady Vivian, who was not without compassion. She could have sought help rather than resorting to blackmail and murder. Her intelligence was her advantage, but also her downfall. She believed she could outsmart consequences, manipulate justice itself. Such hubris always fails, eventually. Reflections on human nature. The familiar streets of London began to appear outside their windows, but Poirot's attention remained focused inward on the psychological lessons the case had revealed. What troubles me most about cases like this, he mused, is not the murder itself, but what it reveals about the capacity for self-deception in the human heart. Mrs. Ashworth convinced herself that she was acting out of love, protecting her husband from the consequences of his weakness. Yet her actions destroyed him more completely than any confession could have done. She created an elaborate fiction, the locked room, the theatrical elements, the invocation of old legends, not just to confuse investigators, but to convince herself that she was not truly a murderer. In her mind, she was merely solving a problem, removing an obstacle, restoring balance to a disordered situation. The complexity of her plan reflected not criminal sophistication, but the psychological contortions required to transform love into murder. The return home. As their car pulled up before Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot's London residence, the detective gathered his belongings with characteristic precision. The case of Greenhollow Estate was officially closed, but its lessons would remain with him, adding to his vast catalogue of human behavior and criminal psychology. "Will you join me for refreshment, Jap?" he asked as they stepped onto the pavement. "I find myself in need of proper tea and perhaps some of Mrs. Pearson's excellent biscuits. The country air, while pleasant, does not agree entirely with the digestion." Jap chuckled, signaling the driver to wait. "I wouldn't say no, Poirot, though after all this talk of poisoned cups, I hope you'll forgive me for being particular about the preparation." "At Whitehaven Mansions," Poirot replied with twinkling eyes. "I can guarantee that the tea is always innocent, and the only danger lies in consuming too many biscuits. Come, we shall discuss the finer points of detection in comfort, and perhaps you will tell me what new mysteries Scotland Yard has discovered in my absence." The final reflection. As they climbed the steps to his flat, Poirot allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The affair at Greenhollow Estate had been resolved not merely through the arrest of a criminal, but through the restoration of truth, the vindication of the innocent, and the provision of opportunities for redemption. The last daughter's 3-century wait for justice had ended, her reputation restored, and her bloodline honored. Most importantly, order had been restored to a corner of the universe that had briefly descended into chaos. The little grey cells had once again proven that no secret, however well buried, could remain hidden from methodical investigation and psychological insight. Human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, had revealed its patterns to one who understood how to read them. The case was closed, but the study of humanity continued. Somewhere in London, Hercule Poirot knew, new mysteries were already forming. Crimes born of passion, greed, fear, or desperation, waiting for the application of logic and understanding to bring them into the light. It was his calling, his purpose, his contribution to the eternal struggle between order and chaos. "C'est fini," he murmured quietly, as the door of Whitehaven Mansions closed behind them, shutting out the noise of the London streets. The last daughter of Greenhollow could finally rest in peace, her story complete, her justice achieved. And Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, was ready for whatever new challenges the criminal mind might devise. After all, there would always be another mystery, another truth waiting to be uncovered, another demonstration that the little grey cells, properly applied, could illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart. Winter had settled over London with the weight of accumulated sorrows, and the grey afternoon light filtering through the windows of Whitehaven mansions seemed particularly appropriate for the news Inspector Japp brought on that bitter February day. 3 months had passed since the dramatic conclusion at Greenhollow Estate, and the final act of the tragedy had just played out in the Old Bailey's most notorious courtroom. The final verdict. "It is finished, Poirot," Japp announced, settling into his customary chair with the heaviness of a man who had witnessed too much human folly. The jury deliberated less than an hour. Celia Ashworth was sentenced to death this morning. The judge said her crimes demonstrated a level of premeditation that precluded any consideration of diminished responsibility. Poirot poured tea with his characteristic precision, each movement calculated to achieve perfect symmetry. And how did she receive this news? Like ice, Poirot. Never flinched, never showed emotion. Even when they read the sentence, she stood there as composed as if she were receiving a dinner invitation. It was unsettling. Japp accepted his cup gratefully, though she did ask to speak with me privately afterward. The detective's green eyes sharpened with interest. Indeed. And what wisdom did our murderer wish to impart? She said something that stayed with me. "Tell Monsieur Poirot that he was correct about the moral compromises. I did not wake one morning and decide to become a killer. I arrived there through 1,000 small choices, each of which seemed justified at the time. The moment you begin justifying small evils for supposedly noble purposes, you have started down a path that leads inevitably to greater ones." Poirot was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in contemplation. She understood at the end. That is something, at least. Many criminals go to their fate blaming circumstances, other people, anything but their own choices. Mrs. Ashworth achieved a terrible clarity about how love twisted by desperation becomes something monstrous. The living and their choices. "What news of the others?" Poirot inquired, though his tone suggested he had maintained his own correspondence with the principal players. Japp consulted his notebook with professional thoroughness. "Marcus Greenhollow has surprised everyone by taking his responsibilities seriously. The estate is solvent again, debts cleared, tenants secure. He writes regularly to Miss Thornfield in Boston, consulting her on major decisions. She's become his silent partner across the Atlantic. And Miss Evelyn, living independently in Bath, would you believe? Margaret's settlement provided her with comfortable means, and she's taken up watercolor painting, apparently quite talented when not wringing handkerchiefs to death." Japp's brief smile faded. "Roderick Ashworth has emigrated to Canada, couldn't bear the shame of the trial, the revelation of his embezzlement. He goes seeking redemption, though I fear he carries baggage no ship can leave behind." Poirot rose and moved to his desk, retrieving a letter bearing American stamps. "Miss Thornfield wrote recently with news that would have pleased Lady Vivian greatly. She has donated Dr. Hartley's genealogical research to Cambridge University, ensuring his work survives to illuminate other family histories obscured by deliberate falsification. More importantly, Marcus has established a small museum at Greenhollow, documenting the true story of the original Margaret. The symmetry of justice." She writes, "Lady Vivian's portrait and a newly commissioned portrait of the first Margaret now hang side by side in the long gallery. The two women gaze at each other across the centuries, united finally in truth rather than legend." Poirot folded the letter with satisfaction. "It is the symmetry of justice, Japp. The original Margaret was destroyed by her family's greed. Her descendant has healed that wound by rejecting greed in favor of honor." The detective moved to his window, gazing out at the snow-covered street where gas lamps flickered against the gathering dusk. "We imagine that murder is an act of chaos, mon ami, but often it is a desperate attempt to impose order on a life spiraling out of control. Mrs. Ashworth tried to write her own ending to the story, to force the narrative to her will. She forgot that in the end, truth is the only author that matters." The eternal questions. The case is closed, but the lessons endure, Poirot continued, his breath fogging the glass. Somewhere in England at this very moment, another desperate person is contemplating a first compromise, a small dishonesty that seems justified by circumstances. Will they recognize the danger before it is too late? Or will they discover, like Mrs. Ashworth, that the path to destruction is paved with seemingly reasonable decisions? Japp finished his tea and prepared to depart. Another success for the little grey cells, Poirot? Perhaps, mon ami, but let us hope that the next success requires less tragedy to achieve. Poirot straightened his tie with characteristic precision. The last daughter of Greenhollow has found her justice at last, her 3-century wait ended by the methodical application of logic and psychological insight. Her story, and the modern tragedy it precipitated, will remain as a reminder that detection is not merely about solving puzzles, but about understanding the human heart in all its complexity. The case was closed. The study of human nature continued, and somewhere, inevitably, another mystery was already forming, waiting for those famous little grey cells to bring it into the light. Outside, London continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the dramas playing out within its ancient streets. But in one precisely arranged sitting room, the world's greatest detective sat in contemplation, adding another chapter to his vast understanding of humanity's eternal struggle between order and chaos, truth and deception. C'est la vie, Poirot murmured, reaching for his evening paper with characteristic precision. The pursuit of justice and truth continues, as it always must. The first warm morning of spring found Hercule Poirot arranging his breakfast with characteristic precision, the marmalade jar positioned exactly 3 inches from the toast rack when George entered bearing the Morning Post on a silver salver. Among the usual correspondence lay 2 items of particular interest, a substantial package bearing American stamps and a letter embossed with the green crest of Greenhollow Estate. Letters from the past. Poirot examined the Sussex letter first, noting with approval that Marcus Greenhollow's handwriting had gained steadiness since the previous autumn. The contents revealed a man transformed by responsibility rather than crushed by it. The estate accounts were not merely solvent, but thriving under professional management. Tenant cottages had been repaired, overdue rents forgiven where hardship warranted, and a portion of the ornamental grounds open to the public, with proceeds supporting the village school Lady Vivian had long championed in theory, but never organized in practice. "We have established the Greenhollow Gallery of Family History," Marcus wrote, occupying the long gallery where so much of our recent tragedy unfolded. Lady Vivian's portrait now faces that of the original Margaret, with Dr. Hartley's genealogical research displayed between them. We have not hidden the darker chapters. Visitors may read copies of the trial records, the newspaper accounts, even your own summary of events. In facing our history honestly, we hope to prevent its repetition. The American package contained a leather-bound volume, The Exiles of Sussex, a Genealogical History. Margaret Thornfield had completed Dr. Hartley's work, ensuring that the true story of the Greenhollow line would survive in university libraries rather than rotting in hidden safes. Her accompanying letter spoke of teaching colonial history, with new understanding of what such forced migrations had cost those who made them. "I tell my students that history is written as much in what is omitted as in what is recorded. Our task is to read the silences as carefully as the words." A separate note from Bath bore Evelyn's increasingly confident handwriting. She described her independent lodgings overlooking a quiet square, her watercolor classes, and the curious liberation of living for herself after 15 years of managing another's needs. "I am painting the lake at Greenhollow from memory," she wrote. "In my version, the water is calm, unbroken. I choose to see in it a kind of absolution." Philosophical reflections. Poirot set the correspondence aside with meticulous care, aligning each piece at perfect right angles. Moving to his window, he gazed down at the orderly geometry of Whitehaven mansions, while his little grey cells processed the deeper implications of these updates. "The affair teaches us something profound about inheritance," he murmured to George, who was silently clearing the breakfast china. "We inherit not merely property, but mythology, and those myths can bind us as tightly as any legal document. The original Margaret was trapped by false narratives that defined her as unstable, unsuitable. That lie echoed through centuries, affecting people who never knew her story existed." He moved to his mantelpiece, where the small blue poison bottle from the case stood as a reminder of human fragility and the persistence of truth. Mrs. Ashworth believed she was the heroine of a great tragedy, forced to terrible measures by cruel fate, but she was merely a bad accountant of the soul, calculating financial costs while ignoring spiritual ones. She balanced her ledger with blood, forgetting that such debts carry ruinous interest rates. The pattern of justice. The detective's green eyes sharpened as he considered the psychological architecture of the crime. Each moral compromise made the next more conceivable, more necessary in her mind. She convinced herself that murder was administrative, a way to balance life's books as efficiently as she had managed household accounts. That transformation from devoted wife to calculating killer reveals the most chilling aspect of human nature, how evil disguises itself as practicality. Yet the resolution brought satisfaction. Lady Vivian's quest for historical truth had been vindicated. The last daughter's reputation was restored after 3 centuries of slander. Margaret Thornfield had chosen honor over wealth. Marcus had embraced responsibility over entitlement, and Evelyn had discovered independence after decades of self-effacement. "Order has been restored," Poirot observed, straightening a microscopic irregularity in his tie. "Not merely in the physical arrangement of evidence, but in the moral architecture of the universe. Truth, however long delayed, has prevailed through the methodical application of logic and psychological insight." The eternal cycle. Outside his window, London continued its restless rhythm, indifferent to the small dramas of justice and redemption that played out within its ancient boundaries. But Poirot knew that somewhere in England, new mysteries were already forming. Crimes born of passion, greed, fear, or desperation, waiting for the application of reason to bring them into the light. He returned to his desk, where the morning's correspondence lay in perfect alignment, testimonies to the healing power of truth honestly confronted. The last daughter of Greenhollow had finally found her peace, her 3-century wait for justice ended by the persistence of those who refused to accept comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. "The little grey cells have done their work," Poirot murmured with quiet satisfaction, adjusting his breakfast tray to achieve perfect symmetry. Another mystery solved, another truth brought to light, another demonstration that order can be restored even to the most chaotic circumstances. The pursuit of justice continued, as it always must, and Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, was ready for whatever new challenges the criminal mind might devise. After all, there would always be another mystery, another truth waiting to be uncovered, another opportunity to prove that no secret, however well buried, could remain hidden from the methodical application of intelligence and moral courage. The affair at Greenhollow Estate was truly finished, not merely solved, but resolved in all its psychological and historical dimensions. The last daughter had spoken her final truth, and that truth would endure long after all the players in this drama had passed into history. It was, Poirot reflected with characteristic precision, exactly as it should be. "C'est parfait," he whispered, preparing to face whatever new mysteries the day might bring, secure in the knowledge that truth, however long delayed, would always find its way to the light.